Hello and welcome to Craftwork, a podcast by writers for writers.
Craftwork is recorded in Fredericton, New Brunswick, on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Wolastoqiyik, the people of the Wolastoq River. I'm Miriam Riche.
And I'm Mike Thorne, we'll be your co-hosts. The music for this podcast is composed and recorded by Randy Nickel Schroeder.
Sarah Bernstein is the author of two novels, The Coming Bad Days and Study for Obedience, which was shortlisted for the Booker Prize. She is from Montreal and lives in the Scottish Highlands. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. Nice to meet you both. How are you both? How's Fredericton?
Good, quiet as always.
And where are you located again right now, Sarah?
I live in the Northwest Highlands in a place called Achiltibui in Scotland. So it is very quiet also. More quieter than Fredericton, actually.
We always like to start with the question, what were some of the books that first got you excited about reading and writing? What were some of your first literary loves?
I started writing when I was like a little kid. I think I was doing it as a way of trying to understand the world and being very shy. It was a way of, doing that without encountering other people. So I think there were, books in childhood that I encountered that would have done that. I came across James Baldwin's Giovanni's Room when I was about 19 or something. And that was one of the first books that I just fell in love with. I think I read it 5 times back to back to back to back. And I hadn't really done that with a book before, just trying to understand how it worked and how it created the atmosphere that it did and just trying to understand sentences and things like that. So I think, in terms of formative influences, that book especially was really important.
I just read that for the first time within the last 3 to 4 years probably, and I was just absolutely stunned by it. I don't know what took me so long. I had read a couple other Baldwin books, but that one in particular is just so special.
Yeah, a bunch of my friends were in a gender and sexuality class at Concordia when I was in my undergrad, and they had that on the syllabus. So that's how I came across it, because everybody in my year was just it was like the Bible of all of us. It's interesting how books like that kind of mobilize that kind of feeling in a group of people at particular points.
What was it about that book in particular that spoke to you, do you think?
The beauty of the sentences was a big thing, but also, reading that as an 18 or 19-year-old, there's something about longing itself as being the object of interrogation, right? The longing and longing without end. That really is what, I can remember of that book, having not read it in probably 10 or 15 years now. And that feeling of, that sort of drives you when you're a young person. And the evocation of desire as connected to that, but not exclusively kind of sexual desire, but the desire for something that's unnameable or unplaceable, I think is what got me then. I'm sure I would be interested in other dimensions now if I were to reread it.
I'm excited that you brought up Giovanni's Room. It is an excellent book.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting because the protagonist is, sort of manifestly not a likable character, right? And nevertheless, you are expected as a reader generally to identify with narrators, right? So there's something in that play too that has interested me. And I guess from that I learned, this sort of idea that a protagonist or a narrator has to be in some sense likable is not really something that you even need to really be thinking about.
Yeah, that's too often stressed, I find. I don't know if it's a particularly recent fixation, but there does seem to be this push a lot of the time toward likable protagonists or likable characters. And to me, that's never been something I'm particularly interested in as a writer or as a reader, frankly. I don't really find likability to be a desirable trait in itself. It's not innately interesting.
No, I agree with that. I think it's something I've had to think about a lot. I think this is a charge that is to sort of leveled at women writers a lot of the time, right? Because there is a tendency to associate women who are writing with their characters, right? To assume that we're just writing about ourselves, and that if our characters aren't likable, then this is some kind of moral stain on us, rather than like a failure of imagination in the reading, right? Which is that perhaps the writer is trying to use a character to explore an idea or an orientation that is not just a statement of the writer's own belief system.
I think of women writers like Joyce Carol Oates, who I personally really like, who kind of mythologizes certain true crime, perpetrated by women. And yeah, it's like, why do women do, I don't know, like what kind of systems are in place that make women bad? I do find that pressure to, as a writer, represent kind of like good representation, where it's much more interesting to think about bad characters, in my humble opinion.
Yeah, or just like to allow everybody like the sort of fullness of expression of life, which is not just goodness, right? And even good people have characteristics that are different from that within them. I remember when I was writing my first novel, I had a conversation with a friend. I was talking about, this sort of idea of unlikability and how I was thinking about that in relation to the protagonist. And he said, why would you make a woman who's unlikable? Like, you have a duty as a woman to make your character likable and good. And I was really struck by that, because I can understand in a way like the politics that was motivating him to say that, right? But also, like, I have a duty to represent experience in all its fullness, not a narrow idea of what a person should be like. But I think that always stuck with me. And I think that was one of the things that has made me think so closely about this problem of likability or unlikability, and why it's so important to people. Because I don't want to like just brush it off and say like it's not important, that it's important to other people. It's just not important to me.
Yeah, it's just you write what you write. You don't really have control over what you want to write. I don't know if that's what you mean, but I do find, I'm interested in exploring the darker parts of my own psyche, or like sometimes recognizing myself in others. And that's how I write, at least. Study for Obedience is an amazing formal exercise in representing consciousness on the page, the rhythms of thought, the digressions, the spirals. And in an interview with Room magazine, you say, quote, "I think I tend to be as, if not more, interested in the way a character tells a particular story as I am in the content of that story," end quote. How do you think about the balance between internal and external dynamics in your writing?
It's a very good question, I think, because like in Study for Obedience, there isn't actually that much sort of objective external action against which this character defines herself, because everything is told in the first person. And there's no dialogue, right? So often when we think of like how to shape a character, there has to be something for the reader that they're bouncing off of. So I think in creating a first person narrator in a book where there is only reported speech, there is a kind of awareness of like, how do you create a basis of reality that people can buy into, I guess, right? How do you establish the sort of rules of the world if they're only coming from this one character? I thought about that a lot, in terms of establishing voice. And that is also one of the things that I am really interested in writing, is like the sound of a character's voice. And that's the sound of the language and the way they, arrange the patterning of the words, as much as the sort of things they say and what they're talking about. So I think that's how I work to generate a reality, even if that reality is a very interior one. If there can be a kind of strength of sound or logic of sound, then I think that's what I was trying to do in Study for Obedience, I guess, if any of that makes any sense.
It does. It reminds me of something you said in an interview with the Booker Prize, when you said that you, quote, write by sound rather than sense. Your prose does have this beautiful acoustic quality, which is bolstered by deliberate repetitions, very meticulous use of punctuation, especially commas. I love the way you used commas in Study for Obedience. So I was curious to hear about style. How did you cultivate that particular prose style? How did it develop for you?
It is a very interesting question. I think obviously, like sorry, I don't want to say you. I don't want to impose my views on, on like or like assume that other people work the same way. But I think as a writer, my style has been arrived at by reading other people and the way they write. I remember when I started Study for Obedience, I was like, trying to kind of mush together Virginia Woolf and Thomas Bernhard and, have the sort of elegiac, beautiful focus on the everyday and the ordinary that Woolf has in her writing, but also the sort of madness and the sinuous sentences of Bernhard, which is shared by Woolf to a certain extent and other modernists, of course. But the attitudes are completely different, right? Like there's a sort of sense of almost self-aware irony in a lot of Bernhard, where there's a kind of earnestness in Woolf. But of course, these things turn and turn within both of those writers' works. And, Woolf deals with irony and Bernhard deals, in sort of earnestness too. But I think I was thinking about those two writers in relation to one another and just being like, what is the way I write? How can you create a style out of these things that you love and something that feels like it can generate some kind of interesting energy? And so that's, I think, where the voice in Study for Obedience came from. And I think like reading Bernhard, who I read not long after reading Baldwin, he was like super in vogue for some reason. I think the vintage translations had just come out in those years when I was finishing university. So everybody was reading them. And that just sort of cracked open how I thought about the sentence, right? Because I was somebody who, like, I taught composition and stuff. So I was like, very like into the grammar of the sentence. But then I started reading Bernhard and I started reading Gertrude Stein. And I was like, actually, grammar is just a convention. And the grammar of the sentence can work really differently. It doesn't have to be correct. It just has to create a rhythm that makes sense within the context. So, like people online often get very annoyed with me and they're like, I hate these run-on sentences. To which I would say, like, they're actually comma splices, not run-on sentences. But, like, the point is still taken, right? Like, I understand that grammatically speaking, they're not correct, right? But if you want to capture the rush of language, sometimes a comma is better than a full stop.
I just started to pay more attention to, like, the rhythm of language, how it looks on the page, and, like, the sound and acoustics. It's something I hadn't done before. And I feel kind of like I meet a lot of people in the writing community who are quote unquote like lish heads and like have read like I know Gabrielle Lutz, she wrote that essay, The Sentence is a Lonely Place, that kind of like played on Lish's consecution and like how to make things sound. And I'm just like presently in a place in my writing where I'm like fascinated by whether or not I should become part of the Lish camp or not. Do you know what I'm talking about? Do you have any opinion on the matter? I'm always just curious to ask writers about this newfound obsession of mine.
I'm really embarrassed to say that I only know Lish as Raymond Carver's editor. And I was a big Raymond Carver head when I was in my undergrad too. Like I was writing these meticulous, tortured short stories after Carver, because that's sort of what I was exposed to sort of at the time. But I don't think the stories I was writing then were any good. So no, in short, like I don't really know what you're talking about, but I'm interested.
Well, I think that it's kind of like a game of telephone anyways. I think that Gabrielle Lutz has her own opinion on like what Lish meant, which is maybe different. But yeah, Consecution, yeah. If you're curious, yeah, The Sentence is a Lonely Place is like an interesting essay that talks about Lish's approach to, or like her interpretation of Lish's approach to how to like create internal rhythm in sentences. But yeah, I mean, then you get down the road of like assonance and printer's rhymes, and I think it's a rite of passage. We all probably have written like very Raymond Carver short stories in the past.
There's this amazing Lydia Davis story called A Mown Lawn, which some people call it a poem, but I teach it as a short story to talk about the logic of sound and how sound can be a driving force in a story. I love teaching that story because people at first are just like, what? Why are you doing this to me? Like, this is nonsense. But after a while of reading it out loud is important for a story like that. People can sort of begin to see how a forward momentum, not that stories need to have forward momentum in any way, but like some kind of momentum is generated through the use of sound and the way that sounds transform into near sounds. It's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, mown lawn, those two words together are so pleasing to the ear. I'll have to check that out. I know that you currently work as a lecturer in English and creative writing at the University of Strathclyde. To what extent do you think creative writing can be taught? And what, in your opinion, is the most important lesson that you think you can impart to your students?
I will answer the second question first because the first one is making me slightly nervous. I think that the most important lesson that I can give to anybody else is to tell people to read. And I know that as a writer, it is important to read, to be able to understand how stories work and how stories can work, how they might work, and to see what other people have done. And I think that that is the most important thing for any person who wants to be a writer to do. It doesn't have to be in a specific genre or anything. It's just to read widely and as much as you can. And then as far as creative writing can be taught, I think there are useful things about creative writing tuition, such as, for people trying to understand that I would say are not dissimilar to the things that are taught in English literature degrees, which are the elements of a story, right? So craft is kind of just like the flip side of literary analysis, right? When we're talking about craft, rather than talking about how meaning is generated, you're talking about how the structure is generated, right? So they are kind of two sides of the same coin, as it were. So I think like understanding the elements of a story, that can be really useful. And I know like I did a degree in English and creative writing in my undergrad. So sort of going over stories like that, to take them apart, to see how they work, that is really useful. And also, this is going to sound very obvious, but I was a very slow learner to come upon this because I think I was the kind of writer, especially when I was younger, who, I had and I still have a very intuitive approach to writing. But the point there is that when I was young, I didn't understand that intuitive approach was shaped already by all of the things that I had read and all of the rules that I had unconsciously imbibed about, how stories could work. So making that manifest and realizing like, you don't have like a particular style that you just were born with. It's something that you've learned, even if you don't know how you've learned it. So being able to kind of step out of myself and see that, the way I was writing was one way. It wasn't the only way I could write, and it wasn't the only way to write. Those are very useful things. But I also think too intense focus on this is how a story should work is not very helpful. I think you need the building blocks and then you just run away with it, right? It's not like a set of rules to follow. And I think sometimes students can get anxious about, okay, the plot arc has to go up, the energy has to go up, and then it peaks, and then it goes down, and then there's that. And that, of course, is one way of writing a story, and there are many very good stories or novels that work with that. But I think obviously there's more than one way to write. So I guess it's both. It's like you have to understand the elements of craft, but you also have to understand that you can just kind of like mix them up.
Do you feel that writers should be able to like learn the rules before they can break them, like feel that they can produce a kind of technically hitting all the notes? I don't know. I had a creative writing instructor who once told me it's like learning the scale for like a guitar or something, and you have to do that first. But that it can be kind of a barrier to some people who simply, there's one element, be it like character or dialogue, doesn't necessarily need to be present in order to kind of like continue on in your writing career.
I don't think that you have to employ all of those elements as you're writing. I just think you have to be aware that there are possibilities. Or you don't have to. You can do whatever you want. Like, I don't want to be prescriptive, but, I think understanding the things that you've sort of unconsciously learned via reading and having them sort of named can be useful for some people. Some people wouldn't find creative writing tuition useful, and that's also fine. But presumably they're still reading and learning that way.
So while we're talking about creative writing education, you completed your master's degree at the University of New Brunswick, where Miriam and I are also studying. I was curious how your education at UNB informed your writing, or your education more broadly speaking. Like, I found it very interesting that you were talking about this idea of meaning versus structure in writing and reading. That's a really interesting kind of dynamic. You've got me reflecting on that.
I mean, I didn't really mean to set them up as a dichotomy, because obviously like structure is one of the things that generates meaning when we're talking about literary analysis too. But I think I've just been trying to because I teach English and creative writing, I keep trying to explain what a craft essay is versus a literary analysis essay to my students. And I keep finding myself getting a bit tangled up with the terms. But my colleagues have produced very helpful documents because they are better than I am, which is great. Sorry, what was the question?
Oh, I was just curious about your experience doing your master's degree at the University of New Brunswick and how your education might or might not have informed you as a writer.
Well, I ended up doing my master's. It was a poetry master's, which became my first book, Now Comes the Lightning. And I loved my time at UNB. I had a great time. Like, I thought the English classes were amazing. I think I didn't take as many creative writing workshops as I did English classes. I like the workshops too. But I think having that sort of English lit side of things really helpful. Also, it was the first long project that I did. It was a book length project and I finished it. And I always felt a little bit like I was cheating because what I really wanted to do was write a novel. But if I tricked myself into telling myself it was prose poetry, I'd be more likely to finish it. And it worked. So I think what I learned from it too was just that it was possible. It was possible to finish a book. That is probably the hardest thing to do as a writer, is to just finish the thing the first time, because writing is sort of iterative. And if you've done it once, you sort of think that you might be able to do it again.
I love that answer. I mean, I'm in the position that you were once in. I'm producing a book length novel. Well, I guess that's what a novel is, for my thesis. So it's like, I don't know. I've never done it before. I'm like, can I do it? But I guess everyone who has yet to write something that's book length has kind of walked the same path. So this is encouraging to me.
Okay.
Speaking of your earlier books, your novel, The Coming Bad Days, I was struck by how arrestingly immediate the opening paragraph is. To provide an example, quote, I began to see my life rolling out in front of me, and it looked like the street on which we then lived, with the blue and green and white houses, and the red and yellow doors. And I could discern the distance in the seasons rolling in, and the apples falling in the orchard, and the windows freezing shut, and the blue smell of spring, and the children in the wading pool, and the baked summer light, unquote. I was just really stunned by the precision of your language and your ability to kind of use like really concrete imagery that's like so evocative. And I was just curious, like, how do you achieve this type of imagery?
I had a poetry teacher at undergrad who gave us a piece of advice, which was that matching up the abstract and the concrete is sometimes an interesting thing to do, but it could have like a comic effect as well. So I think I've always sort of kept that in mind as an idea of like the way to evoke feeling or some kind of atmosphere. Like in my experience as a reader, concrete descriptions are more, or sometimes, effective at evoking atmosphere than the speaker or narrator or character describing their own feelings about the thing. Not always, of course. So I think there's something connected about memory. That first, this is an anecdote I've never admitted to anyone before. So that first paragraph is based on Fredericton.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I can see it.
Yeah. And like, which was a place I loved and I loved to live. But like, I was very frustrated at the time because I was like, why am I not ready to just stay here? But I wasn't ready to stay there then, because it seemed to me to offer a kind of life that I wasn't at the stage in my life that I was, ready to sort of live, evoked by all of those things in the first paragraph. So I guess, you're thinking about like a feeling and the representations of like in that paragraph and for this narrator, like what all of the things that she's seeing represent, right? The passage of time, the inevitable children in the wading pool and the baked summer light, the tidy houses, row upon row of ordered, this sort of idea of an orderly life. So I think in that section, that's what I was trying to think about, right? Which become anathema to this protagonist who leaves her steady life for something different and unknown. And all of these things that she's describing are very desirable, right? But they're not desirable to her, which is the point. And who doesn't want like a house with a green or a blue or red door? Who doesn't want a house, Like, yeah. I don't know if that answers your question. Sorry.
Oh, certainly it does. Thank you for this exclusive anecdote. It is very Fredericton. I love that idea of matching up the abstract and the concrete. I wrote that down. And yeah, I mean, you do so much sleight of hand in this section. Like even the blue smell of spring or the baked summer light, there's a certain synesthesia to the speaker, but it's still immediate, even though it's like kind of a jumble of sensation and perception. So yeah.
There's another passage from your work that I wanted to ask you about. This one is from Study for Obedience, a reflection from the narrator. Quote, I continued to spend the long years since childhood cultivating solitude, pursuing silence to its ever-receding horizon, a pursuit that demanded a particular quality of attention, a self-forgetfulness on my part that would enable me to bring to bear the most painstaking, the most careful consideration to the other, end quote. I couldn't help reading this as a metaphor for writing, which might not be the intention there, but it had me thinking about this topic of solitude as a writer. How do you protect that vital solitude and silence that you need as a writer? I'm always curious to hear how writers manage this.
Well, it was a lot easier before having a child. I'll say that. Yeah, and I think this is something that's like, it's a very live question for me, particularly since having a child. Like, how do you maintain that? And the answer, I suppose, is childcare if you can find it. But I think that like wide open spaces for writing are very rare things. And again, this is something that I had a fiction prof at undergrad who said this to us, which is just that, like, give up on the idea that you will have a wide open space for writing. If you want to write, it has to be embedded in your daily or weekly or, whatever. You don't have to write every day, but it has to be embedded in the life that you already have, not the life that you wish you had, which is, I guess, another way of saying, like, if you want to write, there's no sense in putting it off until you have more time, because you're never going to have more time because the tasks grow to fit the available time. I am very lucky in the sense that I did spend a lot of time on my own and I had space to write outside of work. I no longer have that space, but I'm still managing to write because you fit the task in the time that's available to you if you want to do it. And I do seem to want to do it. But it is like, it has changed the quality of my attention, I suppose, because that idea of like long unbroken stretches of contemplation, like that's just gone. So I have to think of things like a duration of things that is broken up, right? Or that there's something in myself that's continuous, but I can't always focus on it, which is something, I learned from like writing a PhD, for example, which is that you have to trust that the angle you're following is the right angle, that even if you haven't quite consciously realized what the argument you're making is, there's something almost in your body that knows that it's there and you're following a line of inquiry that makes sense to you, and it will sort of make itself manifest once you've written it out, right? And I guess I subscribe to that because I'm somebody who thinks things out through writing rather than thinking things out and then writing it down. So I have to sort of hang on to that, to the idea that like there's thinking happening. It's just not here. It's like back there. So, but yeah, I think that passage too was, I was really interested in the aesthetics of silence because I had read that Susan Sontag essay that I was teaching at the time, and I was just really obsessed with it, like what silence can look like in a text, especially a text with a profusion of language, what silence means, what work it's doing, what political work it's doing, what aesthetic work it's doing. And then also I came to Simone Weil that year also, which is, like a lot of her stuff about the abnegation of the self and, to find a pure form of attention and attention as devotion to an object, which is one of the things that inspired that character, right? Her will to self-abnegate, which obviously is not as strong as Simone Weil's, but is nevertheless, takes something from her thought, I think.
Yeah, that's beautiful. while we're talking about some of the texts you were responding to or thinking through while you were writing Study for Obedience, maybe I'll return to your interview with the Booker Prize and something we were talking about before we started recording. You compared the unnamed narrator in Study for Obedience to the two women at the center of Shirley Jackson's novel, We Have Always Lived in the Castle, in the sense that they're all ghost-like without literally being ghosts. And I was fascinated to hear you cite Jackson as an influence. And I was curious if there are specific aspects of Jackson's work that you tapped into consciously for this novel, and if there are any other favorite Jackson novels or stories that have influenced you in some way.
Yeah, it's interesting because I came to Jackson like late on, and like later than I think most other people, like very behind the times. Obviously, I had read The Lottery when I was young, I think in high school or something. And that's a story that sticks with you. Like it makes an impression on you. It's not something you ever forget after reading it. But I had read We Had Always Lived in the Castle. I can't remember when in relation to Study for Obedience. I think it was after I had already started it. There's like something about, in a lot of her work, the relationship of people and buildings, like people. This is probably a very obvious thing to say because she wrote Haunting on Hill House, but a really interesting dynamic between like especially big houses, right? Like people and houses and how they feel in relation to that, how the house or the building shapes people's actions in particular ways, like how it shields them or exposes them to the outside world in different ways. So I think I was thinking about that, and that's what gave the house in Study for Obedience a slightly more prominent aspect than it maybe had done when I was initially conceiving of it, because the house in Study for Obedience becomes not a character of its own, but not totally inert at the same time, right? Because there's something that, I was thinking about anyway, that the house is, there's a memory in it, right? There's something that is remembered that's in that house that in a way that's not that important to the actual movement of the story, but is nevertheless sort of animating some of, the ways I was thinking about it. And actually, maybe this is the first time I've had this thought. I can't tell if it was intentional or I'm just realizing it now. That the brother acts in particular ways, in part because of the house he's inhabiting, but he also chooses that house because of the way he is in the world. And similarly, the sister coming in, what that means for her relationship to the world. I always have been interested in like how spaces shape people's interactions, but I think that's one thing that I really got from Jackson. And then I read The Sundial a few months ago. And one of the things that is so striking about that book is the meticulous way in which the landscape and the architecture of the house is described, right? Like, the narrator even names the number of columns that are on the front of the house and the statues and all of this. So all of it's enumerated. And there's something in that foregrounds the significance of the building in relation to the people who abide within it. So I think that's something that has definitely influenced what I'm writing right now, the house really taking on a more prominent role, but it also impacted in maybe a slightly smaller way, Study for Obedience.
I think there's so much potential built into this convention of space as a kind of manifestation of psyche or as a representation of psyche, and the way that can represent a form of movement in Gothic narratives, but also, as you said, space as character. And as you were describing that section in The Sundial, it's like the best description of a house I've ever read. And it's so meticulous and detailed.
Yeah, I would say also, like, I was teaching a class on fiction in the Gothic to 1940 a few years ago. And I think, first of all, it was the most fun I've ever had teaching a class. I taught it 3 years in a row, and I really miss teaching it. It's like the only class you can get students to read 300-page novels on because they love it. But all of those elements, absolutely come from the Gothic and my interest, in a kind of oblique way in that too. Yeah.
I don't know, maybe this is a stab in the dark, but this is all reminding me, and your book too, just the way that the house was described in Study for Obedience, it did have this kind of sentience that was uncanny and kind of dread-inducing, which I really look for in fiction, and I think that's like a big thing in Gothic too. But I'm reminded of a book that I discovered, unsolicited book recommendation, but Mike and I both read a book called The House Next Door by Anne Rivers Siddons. It's like a horror novel, but I think she might be like a romance writer otherwise, but on one level it's very like kind of like a John Cheever-esque book about the suburbs and living in the suburbs and this like dissatisfied housewife who is like kind of depressed. I was thinking of Shirley Jackson because, yeah, she is so interested in architecture. I read Ruth Franklin's A Rather Haunted Life, and there's that information about her writing to her parents asking, because I think her grandfather was like an illustrious architect in San Francisco, and kind of like just trying to find the houses to fit like the Sundial and the Haunting of Hill House. But all this to say, The House Next Door has like a lot of very interesting kind of like study for obedience. I mean, it's in terms of tone a little more overtly horror, but it just has this sense of the landscape around a house, like a living, breathing house that kind of exists in its milieu. And it was a real treat. It's like a book that I think about all the time. And yeah,
I put it into my search in the phone, so I'll order it as soon as we get off.
I hope you like it.
Thank you.
I guess you brought up earlier this idea of silence in writing, which I find so interesting. And I did notice in your writing, there's like a relative absence of speech. I haven't read everything of yours, so I can't speak for all of it, but I did read your short story, The Steward of the Land, published in Gutter magazine. And I found that it featured this really like interesting and deftly disorienting blend of direct and indirect dialogue, and a complete omission of quotation marks. And at one point in the story, you even write, quote, "This dialogue, how long would it go on? What purpose did it serve? And where and wherefore was it headed?" unquote, which I found a little humorous. Just want to add it in there. So could you tell us a little bit about your own approach to dialogue, how you feel about it? It just seems like it's something you like to play with, I guess it would be fair to say.
Yeah, I think it's something that I've struggled with in terms of like understanding how to, I think it's something I have an anxiety around for sure, writing dialogue, direct speech. And Steward of the Land was like a playful way for me to sort of begin to deal with that, where the dialogue is very sort of clipped and almost oblique, but there is direct speech in that story. I think in previous iterations of Study for Obedience, there was direct dialogue, but I made the decision to make everything reported speech so that there would be this question mark again of, whether these interactions have really happened the way they're being retold or not. And of course, it's very possible that they all have, and that, the narrator is recalling things in a faithful way, but some of the conversations, there is that question mark over it. So I think that's why I chose it in relation to that. I'm interested in narrators who, she's somebody who's never taken control over anything in her life. She's been dictated to and allowed herself to be dictated to. But nevertheless, she's taken full control of this narrative. She's taken full control of this story and all of the people in it. And there's something in there that generates a bit of tension, right? She's telling us that she has been a good little girl. She's been obedient. She's done what she's been told. She's never put herself first. She's never put herself forward. And yet there's something in the act of speaking that belies some of those claims, right? Because she doesn't allow other people space within her narrative to speak in their own words. So yeah, I think there's a bit of tension there. And I think I am interested in like the power dynamic at play between those two things. And I also think I think sometimes I'm a bit too literal. Like I was really surprised when people were saying, oh, well, the narrator's unnamed and why have you not named her? And my first response was just like, I was absolutely baffled by the question, because of course we don't think of ourselves as our names, right? I don't walk around with my name in my head, bouncing around my head. And she's a character that has nobody to speak her name to her. So of course she doesn't have a name, right? So I think that there is sort of something similar in my attitude to dialogue with that character anyway, which is like, we don't really remember a dialogue faithfully, right? Unless we recorded the conversation. The way that we remember it, it's a sort of acknowledgement that our memories are braiding what really happened, with a mix of the things that, this narrator wanted to hear or thought that she heard or whatever. So there is a partial truth in it, of course, but, there's also things that are layered on top of that, or, sorry, that was like a mixed metaphor. So I think there's something sort of literal in my approach to dialogue as well, and like wanting to acknowledge in a particular way that if you're writing a first person narrator, that sort of shapes the way the story will be told. That's not to say that you can't write dialogue. It's just to say that I wanted to foreground that particular aspect of it, right? That the dialogue would necessarily ought to be in question a little bit, right? Like its accuracy is not going to be 100%. So it's just a question of memory, really. So it's that, and mixed in with like my semi lack of confidence that I could write a good line of dialogue.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've been fascinated for the past while with like the conceit of first person narration and the idea of, I feel like I often misuse this term, but like psychological realism. Like, is it realistic that a person would remember verbatim things said to them? And I mean, maybe some people, I know certainly for myself, I can barely even picture things in my head, which I often am hard on myself when it comes to my writing, that I can't like do that, I guess. But yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I really, for the record, love the unnamed narrator. I don't know how to explain it, but like electing to not use too much dialogue or electing to not name a character does give a kind of hallucinatory texture or atmosphere to a story that I find really enhances, there's a time and place for it, but it just is part of the fabric of it. And it excited me to see that. And speaking of texture, actually, this is a bit of a segue, but you did an interview with Daisy Lafarge for Public Books. You discussed the influence of the painter Paula Rego on Study for Obedience. Do you often draw on visual art in your fiction writing? If so, how does it inform your process?
I wouldn't say I often do, but I was going through a phase where I was going to see a lot of visual art when I was writing Study for Obedience, and the Rego retrospective was one of the things that I had gone to see. It's obviously a bit harder for me to access museums where I live because I simply don't live near any museums. But yeah, at the time I was actually living here, but when I started writing it, I was living in Edinburgh. But I think, yeah, like there are sections that are directly ekphrastic. I'm never 100% confident how to pronounce that word, so I apologize if I have pronounced it incorrectly. Sort of passages that draw directly on descriptions of some of her paintings that I saw. But also the sort of animating spirit of the book came from something that she had said, which is one of the epigraphs of the book, which is women can be obedient. The women in her paintings can be obedient and murderous at the same time. So there was a combination between like the way she thought about her painting and also what I saw in her paintings, which was that these were characters that were in positions of subservience and yet nevertheless exerting some kind of power. So I was interested in that, I guess.
That's so interesting, just generally speaking, too. Like, there's all kinds of ways to be inspired when it comes to writing, whether it's like ekphrastic, that's how I say it too, I guess. Are there any other kind of other mediums that you find feed into your writing? Like I often, when I look at the grammar of film, for example, or even I'm not like a gamer by any means, but like sometimes just thinking of like contemporary textures, like the grammar of video games. I mean, a lot of writers are also like big film watchers. I don't know if you draw inspiration from that or not.
I'm currently going through a non-film watching phase, but yeah, I was really obsessed with this film Werkmeister Harmonies for a long time that is based on a book by László Krasznahorkai and is directed by Bellatar, I think. And it's about a small town where this like giant whale is brought to town, but there's this extraordinary scene in it. And I'm telling you this gratuitously because it has nothing to do with my work, but I just love it so much. But there are these men in a pub and one of them is trying to describe like what a solar eclipse looks like. So he physically moves the other men around in the bar. One's the sun, one's the earth, and like he's moving them around, and it's just really beautiful. That film, is a way of talking about like the recent history without addressing that recent history directly. And not just recent history, like long history perhaps as well. But the way that history comes alive is in the day-to-day actions of the people in relation to one another and their response to this new thing that's coming to the village. Yeah, that was a film that had a big impact on my thinking for the two first novels, I'd say. But yeah, I am going through a filmless phase, sadly. I don't know why.
You mentioned history, and we do have a question to that effect. I find there's like a timeless and folkloric element to a lot of your writing, and this element is often accompanied by like kind of melancholy, nostalgic tone. I had an example here. I don't know necessarily if it's the best example from your oeuvre, but in The Steward of the Land, again, a hostess entertains her dinner guests with a slideshow, and there's this interesting line in which, quote, the projector was contemporary, even advanced in terms of technology, which at least one of their number found disappointing, unquote. And so I'm just curious, like, how do you think about the relationship between past and present in your writing? It seems to be something that comes up a lot.
Yeah, I think in Study for Obedience, certainly one of the key things that I was interested in looking at is like the way that the past is not past. And I'm like adapting, the sort of like I had been reading Christina Sharp's In the Wake and also work by Satia Hartman, where they, talk a lot about this, right? The way that history shapes the present in material, but also like affective ways, right? And so that's one of the things that I was interested in looking at, like the way that the relations between the sister and the townspeople, but also the sister and her family, and indeed, her own attitude to herself have been shaped by history. And thinking about like, if you have an experience of history that is passed down to you from your parents and your grandparents, that is basically an expectation of like a catastrophe about to come, right? A catastrophe in the past that sits in the next and prefigures the next and on forever. What that does to your sense of your own agency in the world and like what that does to your sense of the horizon of possibility. I was just reading a book by Edmond Jabès, The Book of Questions. He has a line, Edmond Jabès sort of writing in a post-Holocaust context, which I crucially did not want to limit Study for Obedience to for different reasons. But he talks about like his Jewish history being like, people return to dust that becomes the stone that will be flung at your, the people who come after you, basically. So it's that kind of vision of history. Of nothing good, in short. So just trying to understand what that does to a person's sense of themselves and the way that they can relate in the world. So taking history seriously as a force that impacts people's lives in the present in ways that are easy to articulate because they can be pointed to, like the long history of enslavement in the United States is still alive and the prison system is still alive in all of these different ways. And like, obviously that disproportionately disadvantage people of color and specifically African Americans. But, I'm thinking about it in like the Jewish context, obviously, that, these structures are material, but they also shape like your orientation to the world in important ways.
It sounds fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah, it is. I came upon it because I was reading an interview with Rosemarie Waldrop in a recent issue of the Paris Review, and I had never heard of him, but Rosemarie Waldrop translated the books into English from French for Wesleyan University Press. So I was very curious. Like, they are definitely difficult to read in the sense of material, obviously, but also formally very challenging. And that's sort of what interested me too.
We always like to ask our guests near the end of the interview if you've read anything else recently that has particularly excited you or that has stood out in some way.
I'm reading a book by Magda Szabo called The Door, translated from the Hungarian, that I picked up by chance in a bookstore, and that I'm finding very interesting. It's sort of framed by a writer looking back on a period in her younger life, but the narrator is sort of the younger her, and she and her husband are these kind of like well-to-do sort of bourgeois people in post-war Hungary, and they engage a woman to sort of look after the house for them. And that woman, interestingly, has a lot of power over the situation, but also in the background of all of these interactions is the knowledge of the recent history of the place and what that has meant and how that's shaped people's behavior, how suspicion comes alive in relation to that. I also was sent a debut recently called The Place of Shells, which I thought was incredible. And I think it's just recently translated into English by Polly Barton. And again, I think maybe people send me these books because like it's obvious that I'm interested in the aspect of like the way history lives on in the present. But in this book, it's about a student who has sort of lived through the tsunami, but now lives in Göttingen, Germany, and how her memories, as well as the memories of the place, sort of take on a kind of material aspect in the place of the city. So it's also about like the ways that we migrate into a past too, that isn't necessarily ours, but how our own past can relate to past of other places. Yeah, I thought that was an amazing book.
Excellent. I love Magda Szabo. I think I've read most of her books, and I'll have to check out The Place of Shells.
What are you guys reading right now?
We are reading a book together right now. We do this sometimes. We're reading The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins.
Nice.
Yeah, just like a fun for us. I really love The Woman in White. I don't know. Mike kind of instilled this in me. I get cravings for 19th century novels. I never thought this would happen to me, but it happens to me now.
That.
So
I guess all in the end.
Yeah. I just read Putain Horror by Nelly Arcan, which I love her.
Yeah, me too.
Mm-hmm.
Me too.
She's
you're
good.
From Montreal, right? Yeah, she's excellent.
She was like, obviously one of my idols growing up.
Absolutely.
Oh, she's amazing. I love her. Her book Hysteric in particular really struck me.
Yeah, it's been a while since I feel like because I worked at the French library in Fredericton at Margaret Michaud, the school, and I read all of Nelly Arcan's books in French for the first time. So that was probably the last time I read her stuff.
Is there anything you'd like to plug before we finish?
Plug. There's another book that probably doesn't need plugging that I read recently called Clean by Elia Trabuco-Zeron. I don't think it needs plugging because I think it's won a lot of awards, but it was really good. This is just stuff that I liked recently.
That's excellent. Okay.
Yeah.
We'll be Googling all these books after this call. So
good. Yeah.
Well, lovely to meet you, and I'll be thinking of your line from The Coming Bad Days when I walk around downtown Fredericton now. So
down Charlotte Street.
Yeah, that's right. I knew it had to be one of those streets. Well, thanks again. Take care.
Thanks for having me. Bye.
Thank you so much,
Bye.
Sarah.